All right, all right, all right. It's happy to have. Oh, good. All right, it's happy to have Dr. Arnold here. Can you introduce yourself a little bit?
Yeah, my name is Arnel Ginaldo. I'm the director of the Biomechanics Lab at Point Loma Nazarene University. We're a small liberal arts university in San Diego, California. The Biomechanics Lab was opened in partnership with the San Diego Padres baseball organization, and I teach full time in the College of Health Sciences.
Nice, nice. Um, I think we talked a little bit about the biomechanics stuff earlier, and I went to visit your lab. It's a
Mhm.
really amazing lab, like
Thank
probably
you.
one of
Thank
the
you.
best in the
Yeah.
country. So, obviously, like the league, NBA are trying to like move forward to this having more understand the
Mhm.
overall biomechanics. Um, Hockey are trying to do that.
Right. Right.
Talk to me about like your experience, like when an organization start to like build this lab, the staff, or like overall the collaboration. What
Yep.
are some
Yep.
like things you think are the most important stuff before we start to collect all the data?
At the end of the day, you got to know the problems you wish to solve, the questions you hope to answer from a player development and health perspective, right? With your systems in place with sports medicine, injury mitigation, all that good stuff. Biomechanics, the science of biomechanics, right? We're applying, physics, Newtonian physics to human movement and, understanding the way people move, kinematics, and the causes of that movement, right? That's the forces, what we call the kinetic sources. Those are great tools. And at the end of the day, they're still tools. They're not the end all be all. They're not going to answer all the questions with one fell swoop. They're going to provide another layer that the coaches, the sports medicine staff can then use to make better informed decisions about player development and injury risk mitigation. So the biomechanics lab gives us a state of the art tool, if you will, that an organization can use to answer all of these questions, but it's only as effective as all of the staff that are involved. The sports med staff, the coaching staff, the players themselves. They have to buy into that. So that's where it becomes effective. It's like, again, it's not the end all be all. It's not a black box. We're just one part of the equation that hopefully will be effective in answering all these questions that the organization may have.
Nice, nice. The following question is like if you look back like 10 years ago, 15 years ago, or
Mhm.
20 years ago, we played the same 82 games. Um,
Yep.
I mean, the training is a little bit different. The training's a lot different, but the same 82 games. Why do you think like we need this biomechanics lab? Why do you think like people think this biomechanics lab may have some answer we are trying to like,
Right. If you have trained staff along with the sports medicine and strength and conditioning staff that understand biomechanics, then it provides us these, like I mentioned earlier, these other avenues that we can answer with regards to injury risks. Like take, for example, hamstring injuries, right? That's very common among, you know, athletes that run and change directions and cuts and things like that. So biomechanics gives us another, I mentioned earlier, another tool, a layer through which we can evaluate muscle activation and joint motion, joint velocities in all three directions in game as well as in the lab, and then contextualize that along with kind of the traditional evaluations that we typically do on these athletes that even before technology that we were doing anyway, right? Whether it's a range of motion test with goniometer or functional movement screens and things like that. Put everything together so that then we can make better decisions about player development. So I think something like, NBA players and organization, the 82 game seasons, beginning to understand how these athletes evolve, understand fatigue, and understand how they get better, how their performance it gets elevated throughout the season, and then not only subjectively evaluate them, but objectively evaluate them from a movement perspective through biomechanics, through the technology that we have available.
Nice, nice. So,
Excuse me.
I remember I was at San Diego. I was at Orange. I visited like John Myers Biomechanics Lab. I visited Christopher Powell's Biomechanics Lab. I went to visit your Biomechanics Lab. I went to visit another Biomechanics Lab, which I can't say, but whatever. And all of you guys mentioned one thing. Even like my mentor, the first lead biomechanist in the league, Adam Pellet, you guys all said the same thing. In the future, the organization will need at least one person dedicated only for that biomechanics testing, interpreting the data. Why do you think that is?
The technology and the systems that we have in play are fairly complex. I mean, at the end of the day, they look frictionless in that now we have markerless motion capture where you don't have to put markers on it. We just have the athlete do their thing, right? But behind the scenes, are the hardware and software that the biomech needs to understand, because the data that we provide needs to be valid and reliable. It needs to be trustworthy. And to understand the validity and reliability of this data, you need to understand, the systems that are in place that estimate, the for example, the torque at the knee when someone lands from a jump, or the kinematics involved in all three dimensions, is the displacement, velocity, accelerations of the various joints of the body. So understanding the biomechanical models would then help the biomechanists interpret and, more importantly, translate the data to the coaches, to the athletic trainers, so that they could better contextualize what they're getting for the data to make actionable insights about the various players. So that's why having that biomechanist is important, because you need that translator, right? You need that person that could best contextualize the data along with everybody else. The analogy I often use, and you might have heard this say this in previous episode, is an orthopedic surgeon that sends a patient to go get an MRI. The MRI center, the radiology center, they're experts of what they do in terms of collecting and interpreting the MRI, the X-rays, the CT scans, and all that good stuff. But they're not going to make decisions about surgery. They're not going to make decisions about treatment. The referring physicians will, given the information that they get from the MRI center, from the radiology center, along with everything else. So the biomechanics lab or team, you got to think of it as that specialized scientific team that works with the various departments of the organization to make decisions, better informed decisions about their players.
Mm. And I mean, this is a better question for you probably than anybody. Um, What exactly is the difference between a sports scientist and a biomechanist? Because I mean, all the team have this sports scientist,
Sure,
right?
sure.
They all try to do is ask this sports scientist to do all that.
Yep, yep. It's almost like there's a lot of overlap for sure. And I would say a sports biomechanist would fall under a sports scientist. A sports biomechanist is a sports scientist that specializes in biomechanics, right? Whereas a sports scientist may, integrate biomechanics data, but they also integrate exercise physiological data, VO2 max testing and catapult testing, GPS, and all of these other sources, kind of non-biomechanic sources, if you will, to make decisions about player development, injury risk. So a sports scientist is probably, for a lack of a better term, is a broader description of a scientist that works in a particular sport that may integrate, most likely integrate biomechanics data along with everything else that they get from, catapult and, vault testing and all that stuff.
but it's like biomechanics is it's a different it's a different world.
I mean, yeah, it's definitely more specialized, right? Whereas the sports scientist will then take all of the data and aggregate them and use kind of a traditional statistical and machine learning models to understand how the data comes together, which includes biomechanics data, for example.
Mm, mm. And uh let's talk about testing. Obviously,
Mm-hmm.
I can't say a lot of stuff what we do, but you do a lot of testing with baseball. You do a
Mm-hmm.
lot of testing with hockey or even all type of sport.
Correct.
So when you are trying to build a testing battery for a certain sport, what are some things you're gonna look at first?
Again, it comes back to the research questions or the questions that the players and coaches have about the given sport, even within baseball, right? There's pitching and there's hitting, right? Hitting is different from pitching in that it's reactionary, right? So we want to work with our hitting coaches and understand what they see in their eyes, what they feel are important that determine a good swing, for example, when they're looking at a 3-2 pitch, a slider in the strike zone, for example, right? So then it's our job as biomechanists to operation define those KPIs, if you will, for hitting or for pitching or for any sport. And so I always sit down if I'm entering a new sport that I haven't worked with before. And I give you a perfect example is lacrosse. We just started this partnership with our locals professional lacrosse team in the San Diego Seals just within the last 6 months or so. And so I'm trying to understand the sport. I need to learn from them, but human movement is human movement, right? And we use the same muscles. We move our joints through a range of motions pretty much the same way, regardless of the sport. There just may be more emphasis on the shoulder, for example, if we're looking at a lacrosse overarm throw, or we're looking at like change of direction or cut if we're looking at a basketball player or a football player, right? So those are things that we as biomechanists come into play, that we understand kinematics and kinetics. How do we leverage that data specifically for the not only the sport but the specific movement activity for within a given sport, right? And so we only are able to contextualize that effectively if we sit down with the coaches and players and strength coaches to see what are they looking at so that we can best operation define those KPIs for that given movement.
Yeah. All right. So following this is obviously the league try and do this because we have a lot of Achilles tendon in the past few years. We
Mm-hmm.
have a lot of ACL in the last few years.
Yeah,
More
unfortunately.
hamstring,
Yeah.
more groin, more calf. So for basketball, just for basketball, um, uh, if we want to understand, obviously there's research
Mm.
out there talk about the injury mechanism already.
Right.
But if you want to learn more about these type of injury, like what is there some sort of testing or we should include in our battery of testing?
For Here's the thing about testing is that you're only getting a snapshot of what that athlete is doing for that day and time. Whether it's in the biomechanics lab or you're doing some kind of function movement screen at your facility or vault testing, you're getting a snapshot. If we want to really understand the way these injuries occur, especially these overuse repetitive type of injuries, we need to zoom out and be able to collect as much data throughout the season to really understand how the ebbs and flows of these kinematic and kinetic markers of these types of injuries, whether it's in the biomechanics lab or in-game data. If you're lucky enough to have in-game data, that's even better, right? You get competition data, competition level, research grade data you're getting within the competition. Then we can really understand what determines specific types of injuries. And, literature is out there about, acceleration, deceleration, and the amount of torque that's created during a particular activity, whether it's change direction during a game or landing from a jump, those kinds of things. Once we have that type of data, especially over, season after season, then we can really tailor our tests accordingly so that we can make some confident inferences about injury risk. And the thing about injury risk is it's probability. We don't know if it's going to happen or not. We just have a increase or decrease probability if they do this, this, and this as determined by our data, right? So we're taking an epidemiological approach, but now we're integrating more dynamic data, more specific kinematic data that could drive these models to better predict these probability inferences about injuries, specific injuries, like you said, whether it's Achilles tendon injuries or hamstring injuries, ACL, MCL, etc.
Yeah. Uh, you mentioned like collect as many data as possible, which I mean it makes sense. But like, so after collecting the data, like what should we do? Is it like collecting data for a norm, or should we? Because at the end of the day, we deal with athlete. Like
Mm-hmm.
1B is not gonna be the same as like me,
Nope. Nope.
right?
Nope.
Like
Right.
Shay's not gonna be the same as like I don't know some random like
One
you,
hundred percent.
or
One hundred
your
percent.
student. So like, does norm even matter?
I don't would say the norm does not matter per se. It just gives us a bigger picture of what athletes do for a given sport, for a given position that potentially could give us insight about injury risk at the end of the day. You're only going to get that with data. Now, to answer your question about individual athletes, you're right. Athletes move differently. Elite athletes compared to other athletes, depending on the sport, whether it's baseball pitching or a basketball shooting guard, for example, they can move differently. Of course, comparing them to the quote unquote norms may not be appropriate. So again, it comes back to what are the questions you really want to answer. And if we go back to injury risk, the only way we're going to answer is to understand as a whole what are those who are predisposed to a certain type of injury, what are common among them, in terms of their valgus torque when they land from a jump, for example, or the velocity of plantar flexion for those who are predisposed to Achilles tendon. It just gives us some metric that we could potentially use to 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 at least make some inferences about injury from a biomechanical perspective. And the only way you can do that is if you have data. Now, great thing about in-game data is that you can also get within player data, right, over time. And then we could compare a snapshot, I don't know, postseason, for example, through what, John Doe did throughout the season. Or last season. We do that all the time. In fact, when we're working with our players in baseball, we're lucky enough to have player historical data for, I don't know, 6 seasons. And John Doe was at his peak because he felt the best, he was performing the best during the playoffs 3 years ago, and he wants to know, I felt better back then, what am I doing differently now from a biomechanical perspective? That is, to me, is golden data, especially from a player development perspective. From an injury perspective, injury risk perspective, then we can begin to incorporate the quote unquote norm. So yes, I think normative data is important, but comes with a few caveats in that we need to understand that individual athletes move differently from each other, and we want to make the best versions of themselves using the data that we have available.
Mhm. You mentioned a lot of time the term joint torque
Mm-hmm.
on this episode. Can you kind of explain like what exactly is joint torque? The
Now
con.
you're going to the weeds of thing, right? So we call it a joint reaction torque, and it's not something that we can, at least right now, can we directly measure. All of the torque that potentially you use from in-game or even from the biomechanics lab is mathematically determined or estimated using what's called inverse dynamics, where we're taking the motion data, pairing that with what's called anthropometrics to estimate the joint reaction forces and torques for a given joint, right? It's a mathematical entity. It's not something we can actually measure. We don't know, at least right now, unless you use, what's called forward dynamics modeling to estimate what the individual structures of the joints are experiencing or how much energy they're absorbing at the ligament, tendon, or at the osseous the articulation level. Right now, you're just getting one torque, or maybe three if you're looking at all three directions, for example, that we assume is happening based on physics, right? At the end of the day. So it's a prediction, right? We're estimating the amount of reaction, torque, and force at a particular joint, and we're making inferences about what that torque means in the grand scheme of things. Excuse me. That makes
Okay.
sense?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So, following to that is so having all these technology, having all these access to data, like all the team have courses right now. Baseball probably a little bit different. They probably use different system. I'm not
Mm-hmm.
completely sure, but like when we use force rate, we use force split metrics, right?
Right.
We're not gonna like we have that all that. Like what kind of data we should look into? Is it like I think we kind of mentioned this earlier, like before in our conversation, is like uh the joint angle what is it called? What is the curve called?
So the kinematics,
Yeah,
right?
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, the kinematics. Anything else we should look into?
I mean, the force plate data itself is valuable. The reason why it's so valuable is because it's feasible. I mean, you can take these force plates pretty much anywhere, and go to a training room or go around the field after a game and hey, you quickly just do a quick CMJ or drop vertical jump, etc. Now that we have motion capture, if you will, markless motion capture, whether it's Hawkeye through in-game or through your smartphone using these monocular systems, it may not be as accurate, but you can take them anywhere. Now you can begin to contextualize them from a kinematic perspective to see, okay, now you've got this counter movement jump. We got a certain jump height, power, impulse, reactive strength index, etc. What are the biomechanical mechanisms by which they're able to create this certain jump height? How are they compensating, for example, or what are they? Are they asymmetrical? When they do either a double counter movement jump or a single counter movement jump compared left and right, for example. If you pair that motion capture data with the force plate data, then we get a full picture of what's happening with that individual athlete, regardless of the movement that they're doing, whether it's a counter movement jump, drop vertical jump, or a change of direction kind of thing. So yeah, I mean, depending on the tools that you have available, you could come up with a battery. Whether it's just a version of a functional movement screen, for example, or an isometric mid-thigh pull, which you can do with a vault test, along with maybe EMG if you have that available, electromyography. That could better explain, if you will, what's happening under the hood when an athlete performs the movement.
Nice, nice, nice. All right. Another topic related to this is um back in the days, I don't know, like maybe 10 years ago or maybe 7, 8 years ago, like we used to think like injury happened because we're not strong enough. We kind of had this conversation already,
Right.
but like when you decelerate, the penultimate step is like 5 times body weight, right? So like, but at the same time, like coach is gonna say like, oh, he's not strong enough. So what's the balance between is he strong enough or is it like is a mechanical issue or biomechanical issue?
Well, they're related. When you talk about a biomechanical issue, is how they move. At the end of the day, what creates the joint torque, what produces joint torque, are muscle contraction, right? We have our muscles that contract and they produce a torque about the axis of rotation, about the three axis rotations potentially of a given joint. How much of the external load that's being absorbed by the muscles I don't want to say it's poorly understood. It's just we don't really have a mechanism right now to directly measure. I mentioned earlier we don't have a way to directly measure what the muscle contributions are to that external load. So when we measure a joint reaction torque, let's say a valgus torque at the knee when someone lands from a jump, which we know through research, the literature is pretty consistent about this, is that leads to a certain type of knee injury, whether it's ACL, MCL, meniscus tear, right, or all three. Unhappy triad, for example. How much of the hamstring muscles or the quadriceps muscles are able to withstand from that is, you can only get that through modeling, and we can't directly measure that. So an athlete could withstand, if you will, multiple bouts of, let's say, 100 newton meters of valgus torque and not get hurt because potentially their muscles are the ones that are able to absorb and generate that energy through the knee joint. Whereas someone else, maybe that 100 newton meters of valgus torque could be absorbed by the MCL or by the ACL, which does not have any contractile elements. So therefore, it's understandable why those particular structures often fail or go beyond the yield strength of their of the underlying muscles, or I'm sorry, structures themselves. So that's where I think the differences are in understanding the way people move when they could do one of two things. They either put themselves in a position where the reaction torques themselves are decreased, or if they're moving very, very fast, they're in a position where their muscles are able to withstand and absorb that energy associated with that torque, if that makes any sense, that external load. And beginning to understand that a little bit better may help guide the strength and conditioning and athletic training staff so that they can train their athletes better to move in a certain way so that their muscles are the ones that are doing all the work, if you will. That makes sense.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Um, all right. So last year, me and my mentor Adam Perry, shout out to Adam. We went on a trip. We used Hawking Dynamic Force Plate. We used
Mm-hmm.
1080. So think it's like 24 or 25 movements. We did counter movement jump, counter movement rebound, s- uh, singular counter movement
Mm-hmm.
jump, then drop jump from three different heights,
Right.
and then
Right.
singular drop jump on the force plate. And then 1080, we did 5 meter lead in decel, 10 meter lead in decel, and then a 505 change of direction on both sides, then 5 meter lateral shuffle on both sides. So what we found, or like research already showed that like when you do change of direction, uh the most amount of force you put in is not going to be at the pivot step or the last step. It's going to be the
Penultimate.
penultimate or
Mm-hmm.
pre-penultimate step.
Right.
But a lot of times when we go to these like biomechanics lab testing, or even in our setting when we do those
Mm-hmm.
testing, we still put the force weight on the last step of change direction. Like overall thoughts on that.
Well, that's why you need multiple force plates. I mean, at the end of the day, if you think about running, change of directions, cutting, and things like that, we typically do that in our gate lab. We have a runway, we have multiple force platform, we have 9 force platforms in our lab, and when we're doing a full blown 3-dimensional motion capture with force platforms, we're measuring everything. We're measuring the cut themselves on the force platform, but also the penultimate step, if you will, to understand the effects of deceleration on these transient forces when they're performing the change of direction or cut or decel or accelerate, right? So yeah, and understanding how that looks like from a kinetic and kinematic perspective is important. Now, not everybody has multiple force platforms. I get that. So maybe you change, the way they start, or tell them, okay, I want you to cut afterwards, or to change your directions after the force platform. I typically don't like targeting. I don't tell the athlete where the force plate's at. If it can be helped, I know sometimes you can. Sometimes it's pretty obvious, but you simply change their starting position, or start when they run, to change their, start with their left side versus the right side or vice versa, etc. So you want to get as much data as possible, but more importantly, you want to get different scenarios so that you can understand what the data points look like when they performed but the particular change of direction or cutting maneuver.
Nice, nice. And you mentioned that you mentioned one thing that on this trip when I visited multiple biomechanics lab, they all did this, but I feel
Hmm.
like in pro sport we kind of forget about this as gait analysis.
Right, right.
Like, why do you guys think gait analysis is valuable? And when it comes to like biomechanic testing, when like a lot of pro sport, they already like throw that away.
Well, obviously, when you're looking at something like walking and running, because gait analysis is walking and running, it may not be directly related to your particular movement. It may, but it may not be particularly related to the movement that you're interested in your particular sport. But everybody walks and everybody runs. And so, return to play, for example, ACL is obviously very important in knee stability, which you need to walk and run and ultimately to jump. There is a heel strike, there is a toe off, in every walking, running, and jumping maneuver you can think of, and change of direction. So, understanding the way a person walks first, especially when they're coming back from injury, will give us a pretty good indication on where they're at in their RTP protocol, right? And then as they progress, maybe you could start integrating more running gait analysis. We understand what normal running mechanics looks like. We understand what normal adult walking mechanics looks like. So that's a great place to start. It's not any different if we're testing just simple range of motion of the hip, knee, and ankle. We all do it regardless of the sport. Why not take it a step further? Okay, now we're going to do a simple gait analysis, even without full blown three-dimensional gait analysis system or motion analysis system. You can use your iPhone. You can use just your observational analysis if you know what to look for, and then kind of progress into running. Just kind of give you a quick history. Yes, I run my own sports biomechanics lab now, but I first started in clinical gait analysis. I ran the motion analysis lab at Rady Children's Hospitals here in San Diego many years ago, and we looked at both normal gait as well as pathological gait. These are, patients, young patients with cerebral palsy and spina bifida, myelin meningocele that affected the way they walk. So it gave me a different set of lens to understand the biomechanical alterations that these neuromuscular pathology plays on muscle activation and ultimately their kinematics and kinetics when they walk. And so to translate that over to the athletic movements space, that begins to understand. For me, it helped me understand what normal walking mechanics is and how injury alters that, and what to look for, and be able to use those as kind of key points, key metrics that we can use throughout their rehab and their return to play, if you will.
Mm. And I want to ask this like really interesting thing because when I was
Mm-hmm.
doing my homework, uh, outside of just biomechanics lab, like the 3D motion capture, triaxial force plate, uh, Tyler Golston did mention one thing. Shout out to Tyler, super nice guy, super
Mm-hmm.
smart. She mentioned you also do EMG force trace.
Mm-hmm. We can.
So talk to me about like the concept of EMG force trace and why you do that.
That's somewhat of a loaded question because I think EMG is one of those tools that sometimes are weighted a lot more than they should be. Electromyography, if you're not familiar, surface electromyography is what it involves is putting sensors on the skin and trying to understand the underlying muscle activation when you move, right? So if I were to put surface EMG on my thigh, on the anterior portion of my thigh, then I'm understanding or trying to understand the muscle activation patterns of my quadricep muscles when I walk or when I run, for example. but it does not give us, it can give us some insights about muscular strength and maybe functional dynamic strength, if you will, during a particular movement. But again, it really, it's your, what it does, it picks up the electrical signal of the all the individual motor unit action potentials that are superimposed over time. When you contract it magnifies them, and then we see when a muscle's on or off during a movement, whether it's walking, running, or cutting. Now, if someone gets injured, we could, potentially gives us some idea of compensation, or if a muscle's not being used when it's supposed to during the gait cycle or during, a particular movement, but it cannot give us force output. If we pair it with something with like an accelerometer or force transducer, then maybe we can optimize what that EMG shows us. But surface EMG is valuable in a sense that we can gives us some idea of what the muscles are doing from an activation profile perspective. But we need a little more information, a little more, how should I say, technology, some other sensors to really understand, how much force a particular muscle is providing for a given movement. Right? But it is useful.
Nice,
Yeah.
nice. All right. Last part of this podcast, I want to ask you, like, obviously,
Mhm.
uh, our league are trying to learn more about the whole biomechanics lab, like some advice for us as a practitioner, as a strength coach. Maybe we
Mhm.
don't have that deep understanding of biomechanics as like
Sure.
you or like
Sure.
Dr. Susan Sigler, like you guys,
Mm.
or like other strength coaches who are all like brand new to this area,
Sure.
even
Sure.
sports scientists, like some advice.
My advice is kind of two ends of the spectrum, or the kind of basic biomechanics and the applied biomechanics, which, you as a strength coach could come in. You understand coach speak, what the players are looking at. Your job, your important job is to translate or be the interpreter, if you will, of all this biomechanics data so that you can provide actionable insights for the players and coaches. On the flip side, you need to understand your systems to the point where you're able to tell the difference between how a smartphone measures something like, I don't know, Varus valgus at the knee during a change of direction maneuver versus what you would get in the lab, or versus what you would get through Hawkeye, and the levels of validity and reliability of these tools, so that then you could tell your practitioners that, hey, we use this particular app to measure, whatever, change of direction, angular velocity at the knee. However, you need to understand that it may be 10% off, or it may be a few degrees off as compared to the research grade motion capture system. That's very important, because sometimes I find that, coaches and practitioners will weigh, their smartphone app, kinematic, joint kinematics that they're measuring from that, um, as much as they would from the lab. And they come with a certain level of uncertainty. And my advice to you is to embrace that uncertainty, because then now you'll begin to understand how much is noise and how much is actually true variance in your data, in this case your biomechanics data, and be able to contextualize it more effectively for the practitioners, but that ultimately are going to make decisions about your players. So understand your systems, understand your technology, very important. It's okay to use some of this tech, some of the kind of, the app-based tech and kind of what I call mundane, more feasible technology, as long as you understand the uncertainty that's involved with those measured or estimated data.
Nice, that's awesome. That's awesome.
Mm-hmm.
That's all the question I have for you today.
Cool.
Thank-
No, thanks for having me. It was a great conversation. I always like to nerd out with you.
That's nice.
Cool.
Okay.
How was that? How was audio and all that good stuff?
It's good. It's good. It's
Yeah.
good.
Cool.
Yep.
Cool.
All
Well,
right.
all right. No,